free and universal medical services, total access to education, even college degrees, absolutely for free. Social success in Cuba is a reality, but the American blockade has caused distortions and obstacles in the international market for the Cuban products. Nevertheless, all this is changing. A few years ago, it wasn't common seeing this kind of private restaurants here in Havana. Now, they are everywhere. Congress delegates of the Cuban Communist Party passed a plan to update the economy, which has suffered a blockade for more than 50 years. But what this update means for the Cuban people and for the foreign investors? Young people like Professor Juan Triana lived the crisis of the 90s. He has become an specialist in the Havana University. He studies how the changes in the economy will help the Cuban people. Is it a reform? That's a correct word.
I would like to call it more reform than updating. First of all, it's very hard to talk in Cuba about an economic model ex ante. Usually, an economic model is an ex post definition. You cannot define an economic model like this before you're doing some things. What you can do ex ante is designing some development strategies depending on your actual conditions, based on your reality. And based on that, and based on what you see in the future, what could happen in the future, then you start issuing that strategies, that development strategies, and after 5, 7, 10 years, depending on how long is your short or your medium term, then you can define what is your economic model and how it is going to be transformed in the future. We have something very important that is happening right now here in Cuba, and it's something ex ante, which is the political and planning will. That is something that is very important. Why? Because many people says, okay, the government is doing this or the government is not doing that. On the other hand, what we can see in the last 7 years is from the very beginning with the guidelines of the Communist Party and the revolution, you can see there reading in black and white some ideas, some guidelines that have become the program, the economic program of these modern reforms. So that is what is happening right now, and
what are the priorities of this update or
priorities,
reform?
Yes, priorities. In my personal opinion, the first one right now is toward the unification of the dual currency system in the country, which is something that we had in the last 20 years in Cuba. I mean, dual currency system in Cuba exists before even 1959. Not dual, multiple currency system. We have 3 different currencies circulating inside the domestic economy. After that, and during the crisis of the 90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we decided to open widely to the foreign investment because we need it. We weren't able to produce and what we need to consume in Cuba, so we really need to export so many things in order we can import what we need to consume. So by those years, the Cuban economy was feeling that a lot of hard currencies like dollars were coming in by many means, and we decided to institutionalize this dollar circulation inside the Cuban economy. Okay, what happened? It was a transitory reform. Okay, it just helped us to solve some problems we had by those years, and it was think that the government was going to change that in the next 5 or 7 years. What happened? In 2003, 2004, when the government decided to eliminate the dollar circulation inside Cuba, we kept the dual currency system. We have the CUC and we had the CUP, and we have it until now, creating huge distortions inside the Cuban economy.
That's very, very interesting. We're now in these private restaurant spaces.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit more inside. So this kind of places, what you were talking about, the new changes, the private sector.
Besides the dual currency system, the reopening of the private sector have been one of the most encouraged reforms that the government have been issuing since the last 4 years, since October 2010, like these restaurants you have here. It's a new kind of opportunities for Cuban people to be done.
So what are the ways in which the Cuban economy is supposed to grow with these changes?
Well, it is not only one way, and it is not only one big economic idea. There is a sort of reforms that touch every single point of the Cuban society, of the Cuban economy. And the government have been issuing many things in many areas. For example, the government have been saying that growing is not a sufficient condition for our development strategies. The government have been saying that growing is a necessary condition for develop ourselves in the future. Is a necessary condition to achieve what we're trying to build, which is the Cuban socialism, something pretty different than what we start building in 1959, or what we can say right now we were building in 1959 until 1989. So I think it's very important right now for growing. Not only rises the productivity rate, efficiency rate, also trying to canalize inside Cuba the foreign investment we really need. Why? Because Cuba can't buy everything we need to produce or to invest in infrastructure inside Cuba with Cuban pesos. We need to have hard currencies like dollars, like euros, and the way to attract that inside Cuba is through the foreign investment.
But the blockade could be a problem, the North American blockade against Cuba, in this
Of
order?
course, of course. The blockade has been a problem since February the 7th, 1962, until now, have been costing more than $150 billion to Cuba and start being a huge obstacle for the Cuban economy. Why? Because on one hand, there are many foreign companies that stop when Cuba asks to invest in, because they know that if the Foreign Asset Control Office of the Treasury Department of the United States track these kind of transactions between Cuba and any other company or any other foreign bank, they can fine this foreign bank with $1 million, and that is really unprofitable. It's awful for these companies. That's why they just decide not to come in. So for a foreign company coming in to invest in Cuba is a top hard decision to come in.
It's a risk.
It's a huge risk. That's why, for example, those companies that allowed us to have trade with them, all those banks that allowed us to do some transactions through them, they charge huge interest rate to Cuba in order they can grant it when this Treasury Department of the United States find them for doing transactions with Cuba. They could have found to pay for that.
Foreign investors could have interest here in Cuba.
Yes, of course. Cuba is Cuba is almost a virgin country. We have many areas to invest in, not only tourism, like we have been doing since the last 25, 24 years. Also the mining, like nickel and tobacco and food production. Cuba right now is importing about the 80% of the food we consume every single year, about $2 billion every single year. So, and we have many opportunity to produce, for example, rice, beans, corn, and some other commodities inside Cuba. And to do that, we need money. We need money for machinery and equipment that we don't produce inside Cuba.
Technology.
Exactly, for technology. We need money for infrastructure inside Cuba. And that money must come through the foreign investment. That's why the government have been saying that we need about $2.5 billion every year as a foreign investment. My personal opinion, perhaps twice that amount of money every single year, in order that we can reach about a 7.3% of GDP rate to achieve our goals. To achieve our goals of as a development strategy.
There's some perception around the world that these changes in Cuba, it's only towards private sector or migration reform, which we had one, and that's part of it. But there are other things like the dual currency issue, we were talking about it. Well, what would be the benefits if that's eliminated?
Well, first of all, the dual currency system in Cuba created a huge distortion. Accountably speaking, for example, there is no way for any Cuban company to calculate accurately how profitable it is or not, because you have two currencies and you're trading with two currencies.
And for the people?
Yes, it is because we have two exchange rate markets, two currency markets in Cuba. One focus only on the business sector and the other one focus on the population. On the population, one CUC is one cubano convertible is equal 24 Cuban pesos. And in the business sector, one CUC is equal 1 Cuban peso. What happened in the population? People are being paid, people monthly salaries are in Cuban pesos. The average monthly salary in Cuba is about 472 Cuban pesos. On the other hand, every single person have to buy the basic product they need to survive, to reproduce themselves in the government stores in CUC. Remember, 24-1. So if you divide 470 Cuban pesos, let's say 500 Cuban pesos, between 24, it is about 20 CUC. And prices in Cuba for basic products in these government stores are pretty high. For example, we can say that a bottle of oil could cost more than $2.
So it's essential, this currency issue.
Yes, why?
To solve this.
Yeah,
How
exactly.
close it is?
Well, I can tell you something which is very interesting and very good right now, and it is that the government is saying one more time, making true one more time, what they say 1 year before through an official speech, that is that this dual currency system is going to change. They're going to unify this currency system in Cuba. And they talk about the day zero. This day zero means that from that day further, companies in Cuba must show their balances in CUP, not CUC. So the currency will be CUP.
So the CUC will disappear?
Yeah, CUC will disappear from the Cuban economy. What happened? This dual currency system doesn't stand alone by itself. It is one reform that must come in relation with some other reforms, like a salary reform, that will be very important. And we're not talking about only multiplying the 24 Cuban pesos for prices that people has right now in the government store. We're talking about setting an economical, fundamental exchange rate that reflects the real stage of the Cuban economy. On the other hand, we're talking about already start in some areas of the Cuban economy, a salary reform, like for example in the biotechnological sector. So people must understand that there is not only one idea about this unification of the dual currency system. There is a full understanding about what the government must do. They are starting these changes inside this monetary system in Cuba by going first to the business sector. It is one
and then for people.
And then for the people, exactly. The end will be a unified exchange, real exchange rate. Okay, that will be the end. But they must start in the business sector. Why? Because on one hand, we must know this. On one hand, Cuba depends widely open of the international economy. We depend on our exportations. The balance between exportations and importations. Okay, to export, we need to produce here in Cuba. To import, we need that exportation money in order that we can consume what people need here. Okay, what happened? Remember I told you, inside the business sector, one CUC is equal one CUP. Okay, so importation companies, for these companies, is very cheap to import. One CUC, 1 Cuban peso. But for exportation companies,
it's not the same thing.
It's not the same thing. So if you're gonna change that exchange rate, that real exchange rate, then when you unify this, let's say 10-1, 24-1, which is right now in the population market, these importation companies will face a very hard situation. Why? Because if you are importing $1 million, or for example, almost $2 billion in food, when you multiply $2 billion for the new exchange rate, let's say 24-1 or 15-1, that is not 2 billion, there will be 30 billion. And for exportation companies will be very good. What happened? In any other country in the world, these companies that becomes unprofitable and goes into bankruptcy, they just have to close. And the government doesn't care about that. But in Cuba, it has a very strong meaning. It's very different. Why? Because many importation companies import what people consume every
Directly.
single day. Exactly. And the way for these importation companies to try to solve this new situation will be transmitting the cost to the final consumer, regular
To the
Cuban
people.
citizens. Exactly, to the people.
For the young people, Juan Alejandro, that were born and raised in the cold special period, which was a very severe economic crisis after the falling of the Soviet Union, what does these changes could mean? For example, here we are in this private restaurant for the young people. This is natural.
Yes. I mean, this new reopening of the private sector in Cuba and this encouragement of the government to the private sector is something not only new, it's something that have been internalized by the young people, in my personal opinion, very strongly. I mean, people really like what is happening right now because it means opportunities, many and new opportunities to be independent. And independency is something very, very good. It's something that young people really like in Cuba. So, in my personal opinion, these young people,
Your generation.
Yes, exactly. We are being pretty much optimistic than 10 years ago, perhaps. I mean, right now, young people are reaching to touch with their very hands the changes that are happening right now. Perhaps 25, 20 years ago, people were thinking about going to someplace else in the world, not because perhaps political reason, but for sure because of economical reason. Right now they are saying, okay, let's stay here for the next 2 years to see what is going to happen. I'm seeing new opportunities. I have to prepare myself in order that I can face these new changes, in order that I can take advantage from what is happening right now. And
More employment, for example? More employment?
Yes, exactly, more employment. I mean, right now, for example, Cuba has about 4.5, 4.7 million people as a total labor force. And there is 468,000 people working in the private sector. So it means a lot. Why? Because you can move from the public sector to the private sector, which is right now pretty more profitable than the public sector. And it's turning in a very strong issue for the government to be controlled. You know why? Because professionals, for example, professors, engineers, they are realizing that working for the public sector in some cases is something that is very hard because the salary is very low. And on the other hand, working for the private sector is very profitable. So they're trying to move there.
Is that supposed to change? That this idea of going to a private sector because the salaries are higher is supposed to change in this new program?
Yes, what happened? I mean, the government is trying to change the salary policy in Cuba. They start on the biotechnological industry. These people are earning more money right now. But
they're exporting to their products.
Of course, that's something. That's the key issue. These people export. These people really earn money. The incomes of the biotechnological sector exactly are $450, $500 million every single year. But professors, for example, we do not earn hard currencies. So the government is trying to move from those very profitable sectors to these other not that profitable sectors in order that people can earn more. What happened? This movement could be slow. And because of this new reopening of the private sector, young people are saying, I'm not going to wait that much. I'm going to move to the private sector right now to improve my life quality, which is something I really need, and it's something very good.
That has to do with the fact that we are seeing here in Havana some phrases that has to do with the political discourse here in Cuba that says that is the economic battle or nothing. Has to do with this thing that you were explaining.
Yes. I mean, since the start of this updating of the economic model, of these new economic reforms, the main battle, the strongest battle of the government have been the economic battle. What happened? On the other hand, I mean, people can say, okay, I have this for free, I have this for granted, but many people realize their actual condition when they face at night the eating time, you know, when they face dinner at night, when they face that they can't go on holidays to the hotel for 5 days. So people say, okay, the economy is bad. On the other hand, when you go to the stores and you see that there are some things that doesn't last even 10 seconds because there are just a few and people really needs them, and the country cannot afford buying more because we have to answer also to some other social demands that are very expensive for the government, then the government realized that it's very important to win this economic battle. Also because Cuba, since the last 25 years, have been going through a very hard crisis since 1990.
Do you think there's a political will to solve these problems?
Yes, of course. I think that there is not only a political will, there's a very strong political will to solve these problems. Not only trying to develop our country, not only trying to canalize foreign investment inside Cuba, also, for example, against corruption inside Cuba, which is something that have been stopping us very hard for moving forward. So yes, there is a full political will since the top levels of the government, since Raúl himself, going through the some other levels, some other administration level. What happened is very hard in Cuba to change a certain way of thinking that have been going on since the last 40 years. So changing these people's minds is not impossible, but takes time. That's why it's very important to realize that those people that want us to rush our reforms are just trying to make us fail. These reforms needs time. What happens? Sometimes some reforms are been going slower than it should. But the important thing is that the reforms needs time, because in Cuba it's not only about changing the economy. In Cuba, changing the economy goes also about changing Cuban people's minds, and that needs time to be changed.
Are you optimistic about all this, like a young professor?
Yes, of course. If not, I wouldn't be teaching in Havana University. I mean, in the Multi-Technique High Studies Institute in Havana University. For sure, I will be going to the private sector, and I'm more optimistic right now. Why? Because professors and people that work for the public sector, they can work also for the private sector. So you can have this dual hiring stage condition, you know, so you can work in the morning for the public sector, let's say in any mechanical workshop, and in the afternoon you can start running your private restaurant at home or your cat company, for example, which is something very interesting. It's a new opportunity that people has, and everything goes about this. New opportunities because it changed people expectations, and people expectation is a key issue for the government and the new design of the economic policy of Cuba.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been very interesting, all these, because